Hey everyone, this is a piece by Heinz Schurer. It's titled Alexander Helphand-Parvus, Russian Revolutionary and German Patriot. I'm reading this because I've read a couple of other of Heinz Schurer's papers, and they were pretty fantastic, very informative. So I'm going to read this one just for fun. I think Parvis was kind of a big influence on Trotsky, so it's kind of relevant to my research on Trotsky as well. So here we go. Among the many powerful personalities who had a hand in the victory of the Russian Revolution of 1917, there can hardly be a more extraordinary figure than Alexander Helphand, better known as Parvis. Indirect as Parvis's influence on the epoch-making events of 1917 may have been, it was by no means negligible. Parvis's career was so odd, his personality so enigmatic, that an attempt at disentangling the many strands of Parvis's life's activities should prove worthwhile. In a memoir written a few days after his death in 1924 by a friend of 30 years' standing, the author made a very high claim for Parvis's importance. Quote, "This man possessed the ablest brains of the Second International, the International of 1889 to 1914, end quote," wrote Konrad Heinrich. Significantly enough, the year 1914 was also the dividing line in Parvis's political and personal fate, a caesura, which cuts his career into two completely different phases and makes of him a man of two lives. Born in Berezin in South Russia in 1867 and spending his younger years in Odessa, the son of a Jewish middle-class family, Parvis's early life followed the standard pattern of so many Russian revolutionaries of the period. There was participation in illegal political circles, learning a manual skill, quote, to get closer to the common people, end quote, and an exploratory trip to Western Europe to establish contacts with Russian emigre groups. In 1887, Parvis finally settled in Western Europe as a refugee, first to pursue his studies at Bale University, and then to establish himself as a journalist in the service of the rising German socialist movement. It was during these years in Switzerland that Parvis first met a young student from Russian Poland, Rosa Luxemburg, born in 1871, and like himself a political refugee. For many years, Parvis and Rosa Luxemburg were to be close political associates. What distinguished both from most members of the Russian and Polish émigré circles in Switzerland and Germany was their refusal to be absorbed by the politics of fellow exiles, but rather their determination to immerse themselves in the labor movement of Western Europe. To them that meant the German social democracy which, after the revocation of Bismarck's anti-socialist laws in 1890, had begun a spectacular series of electoral victories. Quote, "The German social democracy became my home," end quote, wrote Parvis in 1918. However, it should be added that Parvis never lost contact with the Russian revolutionary movement. The tension between these two elements, the German and the Russian, became the leitmotif of the drama of his life. Sometimes the one, sometimes the other would prevail. It seems ironical that the man who came to regard himself as a German can now claim importance only for his indirect contribution to the revolution in Russia. About 1891, Parvis began his journalistic career by reporting on Russian affairs for the Daily Press and for the Neue Zeit, the theoretical journal of German socialism. Soon, however, Parvis was widening his sphere of interest by commenting on internal tactical problems of the German party, and soon made a name for himself as a stimulating intellectual force and as the originator of novel proposals. Particularly noteworthy was Parvis's indefatigable campaign urging the use of the political mass strike as a new weapon of the working class. At the time, this was a new idea, and Parvis soon became a source of irritation to the party leadership. For 20 years, Parvis stood at the extreme left of the movement, endeavoring to fire the German party with something of the Russian revolutionary spirit. In the second half of the 1890s, the party's leadership found itself exposed to the formidable challenge made against its traditionally Marxist philosophy by Edward Bernstein and his followers. With Bernstein's, quote, revisionist, end quote, attack from the right came Parvis's great opportunity. It was Parvis who in 1898 sounded the alarm against the, quote, revisionist menace, end quote, in a series of leading articles in the Dresden Party paper. Parvis became known internationally as the man who started the great Bernstein discussion, which was to split the party until 1914. With him on the staff of the Dresden paper was Julian Marchalewski, another member of Rosa Luxemburg's old Swiss circle of Polish refugees. Many years later, Trotsky recalled the profound influence these articles by Parvis had on him at the time after old copies of the paper reached him in Russia. Parvis instinctively felt that the period ahead was one of great upheaval and was convinced that the transition to socialism was not a question of a remote and nebulous future, but was on the threshold of the present. This impressed Trotsky, the much younger man, very deeply. The year 1898, which brought Parvis considerable fame as the scourge of the revisionists, also meant a crisis in his personal circumstances. After having been banished from Prussia in 1893, he was now expelled from Saxony, together with Marchalewski. On their enforced departure from Dresden, they succeeded in having Rosa Luxemburg appointed editor instead. This was her introduction to the German socialist press, and later on both Rosa Luxemburg and Marchalewski were to leave their mark in the annals of German communism. Parvis, finding most of Germany closed to him, went in for an enterprise typical of his defiant temperament. With Karl Lehmann, a socialist doctor from Munich, as his companion, and duly equipped with a false passport, he set off to study the famine regions of Russia along the Volga. They reported their findings in a substantial volume published in Germany on their return. Settling in Munich in 1900, Parvis resumed his struggle against revisionism in a series of articles which were so outspoken that the party leadership was again taken aback. Only recently have documents come to light which illustrate very clearly to what extent Parvis and Rosa Luxemburg were regarded as hotheads and firebrands by the party hierarchy, something of an alien intrusion in the solid body of German socialism. They also reveal the tremendous animosity toward them in many party circles. Parvis found himself boycotted, and whatever the attractions of the role of enfant terrible, he felt very acutely the insecurities of his position, dependent as it was on the shifting alliances between party leadership and the left-wing intelligentsia of Marxist theoreticians. When in Dresden, he had become interested in the business of running a newspaper and had carried out a highly successful reorganization of the Dresden Socialist Daily. Thus, in 1902, in desperation, Parvis decided that he must have a journal of his own and thereby become independent of the changing moods of the party. As a means of raising the necessary money, he founded a publishing house of his own in Munich. At that time, Russia had not joined the International Copyright Convention of Berna, and Russian authors' rights were not protected abroad. By publishing their works first in Russian in Munich in small token quantities, their copyrights for the German market and other countries would be established and translation royalties ensured for the authors. Marchalewski was won over to the plan, and the firm was set up in Munich under his name. Their best-known publication was Gorky's The Lower Depths. And Parvis had also a share in the production of the play by Max Reinhardt, which created an international sensation. The joint venture was short-lived as the two partners were caught up in the maelstrom of the Russian Revolution of 1905. Their firm had to be liquidated in 1906, leaving behind a great deal of ill feeling between the two men and between Parvis and Gorky as well. As the financial basis of a great international socialist journal, a mouthpiece of the extreme left, the Munich publishing house was a complete failure. Ever since his arrival in Switzerland in 1887, Parvis had kept in close touch with the nascent Russian Marxist movement. In 1896, he was a member of the Russian delegation to the London Congress of the Socialist International. A man of his reputation could be of great value to the rising Russian social democracy. It was Parvis who persuaded Lenin to choose Munich as the place of publication of Iskra in 1900. Parvis became one of its most valued contributors. When the famous break between Bolsheviks and Mensheviks occurred in 1903, Parvis sided with the Mensheviks, but typically enough kept his own political viewpoint above the two Russian factions. Parvis and Rosa Luxemburg both upheld the conception of the spontaneous action of the masses, as opposed to the Leninist idea of direction of the movement by a spearhead of professional revolutionaries. It was at the time of the joint publishing venture with Marchalewski that a young Russian Marxist came to him who found it equally impossible to fit into either side of the Bolshevik-Menshevik controversy. This was Trotsky, Parvis's junior by 12 years. Parvis, with his 15 years' experience in the German movement, became his teacher as well as his host. His way of looking at politics, his broad perspectives, his love of such sweeping generalizations as his new idea of the obsolescence of the nation-state influenced Trotsky for the rest of his life. In 1915, after Trotsky's way had parted from that of the transformed Parvis of the war years, the former disciple generously spoke of Parvis as the one man, quote, to whom he has been indebted for his ideas and intellectual development more than to any body of the older generation of European social democrats, end quote. Trotsky. In 1917, when Trotsky, after the Petrograd July demonstrations, was held in prison by the provisional government and was questioned, Trotsky stated that the years of his close association with Parvis had been from 1904 to 1909. By the end of 1904, Trotsky had completed the manuscript of a pamphlet on the prospects of the Russian Revolution to come. No sooner had Trotsky placed it in Parvis's hands than the stirring events of January 9, 1905 took place. Profoundly moved by these developments, Parvis wrote a preface to the pamphlet, which in the boldness of its prognosis went far beyond anything any Russian Marxist had yet dared to predict. Parvis set the course firmly for the conquest of political power in Russia by the Social Democratic Party alone. This forecast had the effect of a bombshell in Russian socialist circles. To us nowadays, communism is indissolubly linked with the industrialization of underdeveloped countries. To Parvis's generation, the transition to socialism was equally linked with the most advanced countries of Western Europe. Parvis's prediction upset all established theories. Lenin regarded his assumptions as fantastic. With his concept, Parvis had put himself far to the left of the main body of Russian Marxism. The only one who accepted the idea was Trotsky. The story of the Russian Revolution is the story of the conversion of Lenin to the Parvis-Trotsky line in 1917, when it had to be forced on the Bolsheviks by Lenin against the strongest possible opposition. If any man can be called the intellectual begetter of the October Revolution as it actually happened, this man is Parvis. In 1915, Trotsky, referring to his views on the character of the coming Russian Revolution, had the fairness to say, quote, even now I see less reason than ever to renounce that diagnosis and prognosis, the lion's share of which was contributed by Parvis, end quote. Trotsky. Trotsky left for Russia at the beginning of 1905 to resume illegal political work. Parvis went in October of the same year, and the great exodus of the exiled revolutionaries from Western Europe back to Russia and Poland began, among them Rosa Luxemburg and Marchlewski. However, deep the roots they had struck in the German movement, the Russian Revolution of 1905 drew them like a magnet. Although Parvis and Trotsky were outsiders in the eyes of both Marxist factions, the Mensheviks were more tolerant than the Lenin group. Parvis and Trotsky's paper, Nachalo, The Beginning, started at the end of 1905 in St. Petersburg, nominally as a Menshevik organ, became the influential advocate of their new theory, which ultimately became known as the theory of the permanent revolution. Liberal journals contrasted the comparatively moderate position of Lenin, who looked at the idea of permanent revolution as hopelessly utopian, to the wild ravings of Parvis and Trotsky. The relation between the two men changed rapidly. The disciple of the Munich days revealed himself as a great revolutionary leader, while the older man was not cut out for such a role. Only after the revolutionary wave was receding was he made chairman of the Second Soviet of Workers' Deputies in St. Petersburg, and proved disappointing. Quote, Parvis's political career is finished, end quote, wrote Maxim Gorky in a private letter. The Bolshevik representative in this Second Soviet was Alexinsky, who was to play his part in Parvis's and Trotsky's lives again. At the beginning of 1906, Parvis was arrested and joined Trotsky as a fellow prisoner in the Peter and Paul fortress. Rosa Luxemburg herself was released from a Warsaw jail, succeeded in visiting them. After a term in the fortress, the next stage was Siberia. At the end of 1906, Parvis escaped. Parvis's friend, Konrad Heinisch, then editor of the Dortmund Socialist Daily, had the surprise of his life when Parvis suddenly appeared on his doorstep in December 1906. He had to go into hiding at once and lived illegally in Dortmund for about 8 weeks. At this stage, Parvis's only possessions were the clothes he wore. The Munich publishing firm had been liquidated during his absence, and he had to start all over again, and at this moment it was quite impossible to launch a new business venture. In 1907, Parvis published an account of his adventures in Russia entitled In the Russian Bastille. In the summer of the same year, Trotsky, too, had managed to escape from Siberia appeared in Germany. Parvis arranged for the publication of the story of his escape and of his history of the 1905 revolution. When Cherevinin's book presented the story of 1905 to German readers from the Menshevik angle, it was Trotsky who was given the chance to review the book in the Neue Zeit in the light of the theory of the permanent revolution. The Parvis-Trotsky theory gained such distinguished German adherents as Kautsky and Mehring. At the 1907 Congress of the temporarily united Russian Social Democratic Party, Rosa Luxemburg also came over to the theory of the permanent revolution. In 1917, Luxemburg would find no difficulties in accepting its application in practice, which by then had become the policy of Bolshevism. Luxemburg's, quote, Spartacus letters of 1918 are brilliant expositions of the Parvis-Trotsky theory. The peak year in Parvis's life was 1905. After 10 years of preaching the gospel of the political strike to the deaf ears of the German party hierarchy, this form of political action became the characteristic feature of the events in Russia. In the Bolshevik-Menshevik controversy, Parvis had championed the concept of the spontaneous unorganized activity of the masses, and on the touchstone of the 1905 revolution, the soundness of his assumptions seemed to have been proved. After the stirring days in Russia, life in Germany seemed stale and uninspiring. Trotsky thought that the quality of Parvis's writings declined during this period. Parvis must have felt something of the sort himself. He felt restless and in need of a change of milieu. After moving to Vienna in 1910, he settled in Constantinople to carry on his work as a journalist there. He sensed that the next great political crisis would come from the Balkans. At first, he reported brilliantly on a Young Turk movement for the German socialist press. At first, he reported brilliantly on a Young Turk movement for the German socialist press while carrying on his hand-to-mouth existence as an impecunious journalist. Then Parvis started contributing articles to Le Jeune Turquie. I don't know if I'm saying if that's how you say it or not. The Journal of the New Government. The first of these essays opening with the defiant words, quote, "This article is written by a revolutionary Marxist," end quote. Parvis's novel analysis of the impact of Western European economic imperialism on Turkey made a considerable impression. Gradually, a change came over Parvis's personal circumstances. Parvis started acting as business advisor to Russian and Armenian merchants in Constantinople, became prosperous, and began laying the foundations of a business career of his own. In August 1914, Parvis's personal position changed overnight. By displaying business acumen of quite an exceptional order, Parvis suddenly became a key figure in the economic mobilization. In the economic mobilization. Come on, sorry, my computer's being a butt. One second. Come on, you son of a gun. Alright, so where the fuck am I? Huh? By displaying business acumen of quite an exceptional order, Parvis suddenly became a key figure in the economic mobilization of Turkey, and the very first days of the war turned him into a very rich and influential man. Equally sudden and astonishing was his political metamorphosis. In August 1914, a new Parvis was born. The old Russian revolutionary emerged as one of the most active protagonists of the German cause in Turkey. While the German social democracy unanimously supported the German war effort, Parvis justified this policy with revolutionary arguments. Parvis maintained that the interests of international socialism demanded the victory of the country with the most highly developed working class movement. In other words, the victory of Imperial Germany. The war had forced the Central Powers into a revolutionary role toward Tsarist Russia. The alliance between Prussian bayonets and Russian proletarian fists would bring about the Russian Revolution. Parvis was unique in being the one Russian socialist to take his stand as a German patriot. All Parvis's old associates in the German party with a similar background to his, such as Rosa Luxemburg and Marchlewski, took an internationalist position, as did his old friend Trotsky and the majority of Russian Social Democrat emigres, Bolsheviks and Mensheviks. Parvis's ties with his old circle snapped suddenly. To all those who supported the Russian war effort, including those Russian emigres favoring the cause of the Allies, Parvis became the arch-traitor. One of the separatist Ukrainian organizations enjoying the sponsorship of Austria-Hungary was the League for the Liberation of the Ukraine. It stood for the defeat of Russia and the disruption of the Russian Empire. At the end of 1914, while still in Constantinople, Parvis wrote a pamphlet for the League setting forth his pro-German views. From now on, he was regarded with hatred in Russian patriotic circles. In January 1915, Parvis quite openly appeared in neutral Bulgaria in his new role of German apologist. Party frontiers not being so strict as they were to become later, it was the left-wing Social Democrats, the so-called, quote, narrow faction, which had invited him to address them in a public meeting. Parvis urged them to support the German cause for the sake of the ultimate victory of socialism, while Plekhanov had urged them to support the Allied cause for exactly the same reason. The Bulgarians remained unconvinced by either and continued to oppose the entry of their country into the war. Parvis's intervention in Bulgaria caused a considerable stir. Parvis, the well-known Russian revolutionary, had placed himself among those German social democratic leaders who traveled all over Europe putting the German case to the socialists of the neutral countries. It was in Romania, in the same month of January 1915, that Parvis embarked on a new kind of activity. Romania was likely to enter the war on the side of the Allies, and this was opposed on internationalist grounds by the leader of the Romanian socialists, Rakovsky, a personal and political friend of Trotsky. I have a little biography actually it's a pretty substantial biographical essay on Rakovsky on this channel. When the German socialist deputy, Sudekum, tried to bring Rakovsky over to a defiantly pro-German attitude and offered subsidies, his overtures were rejected. Parvis made a new attempt in the same direction, but it may be safely assumed that he failed with Rakovsky in Bucharest, as he had failed with Blagoev in Sofia. Yet, with his knowledge of Balkan politics, all the available evidence suggests that he succeeded as a political agent while being unsuccessful on the political plane. Owing to Parvis's intention, German subsidies appear to have reached the Romanian socialists in 1915 and 1916, in all likelihood by devious means. The fact of the personal meetings between Parvis and Rakovsky in 1915 was held against Rakovsky by Russian Patriot emigres and pro-Allied Romanian publicists who branded Romanian socialists as a German tool. These charges turned up again at the trial of Rakovsky in Moscow in 1938. Romania presents a clear case of the Germans giving financial aid to a revolutionary socialist movement whose aims coincided with theirs. The documentary evidence, however, only came to light in 1958. There was no proof for it at the time. In continuing the story of Parvis's meetings with representatives of the Revolutionary Internationalist Group, it should be mentioned that he managed to meet Lenin in Switzerland in May or June 1915, and at the same time also spoke to some members of Trotsky's group in Zurich. These were contacts on a purely political plane, but Parvis had as little success with the Russian emigres in Switzerland as with the Balkan socialists. Some months earlier, in February 1915, had come the first denunciation of Parvis as a renegade from the revolutionary ranks. The author of the attack was Trotsky, Parvis's friend of many years' standing, who published his, quote, epitaph for Parvis in his Paris paper, Naše Slovo. The break was announced in a dignified manner and with obvious regret. By this time, Parvis had elaborated his master plan. Germany should use all means available to stir up revolutionary troubles in Russia, using the émigré groups and the existing underground organizations. Parvis put forward these proposals in a memorandum submitted to the German government at the beginning of 1915. The old advocate of the political mass strike, the prominent participant of the Russian Revolution of 1905, offered his 25 years' experience in the socialist movement to the German authorities to bring about the defeat of Russia from within. The memorandum showed an amazing knowledge of the Russian political scene and struggled out the and singled out the Bolsheviks as the most determined group capable of action. Parvis's plan proposed the political direction of the movement by the Germans. As a first step, he suggested the calling of a united Congress of all emigre groups and parties in Switzerland. The whole idea of organizing a revolution in Russia from outside, directed and financed by Germany, seems fantastic in the extreme, and so it proved to be. But such was the ability and political knowledge of Parvis that the German authorities were considerably impressed. In March 1915, Parvis, still nominally an enemy alien, was given special facilities for foreign travel, and 2 million marks were made available for revolutionary propaganda in Russia, in a large part of which sum was entrusted to Parvis to use at his discretion. In July, another 5 million marks were allocated for the same purpose. No details are, however, available as to whom this latter sum was passed. The man who acted as Parvis's protector from 1915 onwards was the highly original German minister in Denmark, Brockdorff Rantzau. After the February Revolution of 1917, the latter was to criticize the German Foreign Secretary, Jagov, it might be how you pronounce it actually. After the February Revolution of 1917, Brockdorff Rantzau was to criticize the German Foreign Secretary, Jagov, who held office until November 1916, for not listening to Parvis's advice. Parvis, while being entrusted with large sums, was obviously not taken too seriously in some of the official German circles. They definitely rejected his suggestion to undermine the Russian currency. In the spring of 1915, Parvis turned up again in Germany after more than 4 years' absence. The man whom his old associates remembered as a poverty-stricken Russian emigre journalist of the extreme socialist left, once hounded from one German state to the next, had indeed undergone an astonishing metamorphosis. Parvis now was a very rich man engaged in large-scale international business transactions in the Balkans and in Scandinavia. Even after Romania had joined the Allies in 1916, he managed to secure Romanian wheat for Germany. Yet Parvis still regarded himself as a socialist. Wherever Parvis went in Europe, it was the socialist and trade union movements with which Parvis established contacts. Parvis's most considerable political achievement was to be his outstanding work for the German cause in Denmark, where, in 1916, Parvis established excellent relations with the Danish trade unions. These were based on his successful commercial operations with the fuel supply organization set up by these unions for the benefit of their members. This serious contribution to the German war effort impressed Brockdorff Rantzau and inspired Brockdorff Rantzau with confidence in Parvis's ambitious plans for Russia. From the middle of 1915 to the middle of 1917, Copenhagen became Parvis's headquarters. Here, in 1915, he founded his Institute for the Study of the Social Consequences of the War. Parvis invited Russian émigrés committed to the revolutionary internationalist cause to join its staff. In his Paris paper, Trotsky warned his comrades against having anything to do with this institute, as it was bound to be a German propaganda agency. In his purely commercial undertakings, however, there were many Russian refugees working for Parvis who belonged to all shades of political opinion. A prominent Bolshevik, Heinz, worked as a business executive for a firm in Copenhagen, which was controlled by Parvis. At last, with plentiful funds, he was in a position to found a journal of his own and to realize his old dream. Parvis, now made a Prussian citizen for his war services, again established a publishing house in Munich. With Herzen's Kolokol in mind, Parvis somewhat ambitiously christened his new journal Die Glocke. Parvis's old friend Heinrich became its editor. Publication started in August 1915, and the core of the contributors consisted of old members of the pre-war left wing of the Social Democratic Party who now supported Germany's war effort with arguments couched in strictly Marxist terminology. During the course of the war, Parvis became the trusted advisor of the two acknowledged chiefs of the party, Ebert and Scheidemann. With the Glocke as clear evidence of Parvis's newfound political convictions, Lenin went out of his way to chastise Parvis as a renegade from the cause of revolutionary internationalism. Lenin called Parvis the German Plekhanov, who, like the latter, had become a patriotic supporter of an imperialist power. This attack was published in November 1915 in Lenin's journal, The Social Democrat, appearing in Geneva. In the early months of 1915, the former Bolshevik deputy in the Second Duma, Alexinsky, had begun waging a bitter campaign against Parvis. Alexinsky had been associated with Parvis in the Petersburg Soviet in 1905, had been living in Paris as an émigré for some years, and at the outbreak of the war had turned ardent Russian patriot. He saw German agents and German spies everywhere. Trotsky, Lenin, and Blagoev had attacked Parvis on purely political grounds. Alexinsky went much further and called him an agent provocateur. Alexinsky also denounced Trotsky as pro-German. Trotsky had to make it quite clear that he condemned Parvis as a German patriot, but did not regard him as an agent provocateur. In spite of the fact that Trotsky had publicly broken with Parvis as early as February 1915, Alexinsky charged him with being Parvis's close associate on the strength of their pre-war alliance. In defending themselves against Alexinsky, Parvis, Trotsky, and the Bolsheviks were forced into some sort of common front. While chastising Parvis on political grounds, Trotsky and the Bolsheviks never treated Parvis as a secret agent of the German government. This distinction must be borne clearly in mind. In the light of the recently published German documents, what were the results of Parvis's work in stirring up political strife in Russia? As far as the records go, we only know that large payments were made to Parvis for this purpose in March, July, and December 1915. There is an unmistakable element of, quote, our man in Havana, end quote, about these machinations. In December 1915, Parvis modestly estimated that about 20 million rubles would be required to get the Russian Revolution completely organized. Parvis added thoughtfully that this total could not be distributed at once, else there would be a risk of its source being discovered. Still, for the moment, he would be content with a mere 1 million rubles to be handed over at once to his confidential agent, as he wanted the revolution to start on the 19th of January, 1916, the anniversary of the Black Sunday of 1905. Before dismissing all this as comic opera, it is well to bear in mind that since 1905, the 9th of January had been traditionally remembered by the Russian working class by demonstrations and strikes. Parvis's confidential agent was stated by him to have got through to Petrograd, and there seems no doubt that the 1 million rubles vanished into Russian pockets all right, but Parvis could only produce some embarrassing excuses for the total absence of any results. The Great Russian Revolution of January 1916, organized by Parvis, had not come off. Not surprisingly, after December 1915, there was nothing more in the document showing that Parvis ever received any further subsidies for secret work in Russia. No one nowadays seriously suggests that the February Revolution of 1917 was organized with German gold. However, the new situation created by the revolution gave Parvis his chance. In April 1917, Parvis made his one great practical contribution to the Bolshevik victory of October. The most recent German student on the subject, W. Hallweg, is convinced that all the available evidence suggests that it was Parvis who conceived the idea of Lenin's journey from Switzerland through Germany to Russia. Ably supported by Brockdorff-Rantzau, he had the lion's share of the work of this sensational return. By this move, Parvis made a genuine contribution to world history, as Lenin's arrival in Petrograd in April 1917 brought about the decisive turn of events. It was then that Lenin presented the Parvis-Trotsky line of 1905 as Lenin's own prognosis to his astonished followers. The events of April 1917 unite the two achievements, which give Parvis whatever historical significance he has, the conception of the theory of the permanent revolution, and is initiating Lenin's journey with its fateful consequences. It was in connection with this journey that in April 1917, Brockdorff-Rantzau recommended Parvis to Zimmermann, the German Foreign Secretary since November 1916. He expressed regret that not enough attention had been paid to Parvis with regard to Russia. In the strongest terms, he urged the use of Parvis's talents in the new situation and singled Parvis out as the one man capable of establishing good relations with the Russian left. Gone were the days when Parvis was looked upon as an agent employed for the purpose of supplying German money to Russian political groups. Parvis's successful work in Denmark in 1916 marked Parvis out for important political missions to act as a kind of ambassador to the socialist parties of Russia. Quote, the connections which Helphand has in Russia could now, be decisive to the whole situation, end quote, wrote Brockdorff-Rantzau on April 2nd, 1917. The obvious way for Parvis to meet the Russian socialists was the great projected Stockholm Conference, where the socialists of the Central Powers, of the Allies, and of the neutrals were expected to gather in a preparatory peace conference. Brockdorff-Rantzau's recommendation succeeded. In May 1917, Parvis went to Stockholm, quote, with the object of working for our interests at the impending Socialist Congress, end quote, as the Foreign Secretary put it in his note of introduction to the German minister in Sweden. Since the February Revolution, a change had taken place within the ranks of Russian socialism, with many of those opposed to the Russian war effort under the Tsar now favoring the cause of the Allies since the Russian Republic had been established. The Bolsheviks had become the leading anti-war party. Parvis's aim was now a great alliance between Lenin's party and his own, the German patriotic Social Democrats. But it takes two to make an alliance. The Bolsheviks absolutely refused to have any political dealings with Parvis. When Parvis, authorized by his party to speak to the returning Bolsheviks in Sweden in April 1917, hurried to Stockholm, Lenin refused to meet Parvis and asked his comrades to put his refusal on record. Lenin's attitude was quite incomprehensible to the man who had done more than anybody to uncork the genie of revolution. In May 1917, however, Parvis had good grounds for hoping that a Bolshevik delegation would arrive in Stockholm. In the Petrograd Soviet, Kamenev had spoken in favor of participation. With the arrival of Lenin in Russia, however, the Bolsheviks made a volte-face concerning the Stockholm issue and decided to boycott the conference. Parvis had to be content with talks with the Menshevik and Social Revolutionary delegation from Petrograd, but there was no chance of preparing a separate peace by negotiations with these pro-Allies socialists. In July 1917, the storm suddenly burst and Parvis's name swept into the headlines of all Russian papers. He figured prominently the charges wildly flung about in the great campaign accusing the Bolsheviks of being German agents. The attack was led by Parvis's old enemies Alexinsky and Burtsev, now returned to Russia from Paris. Lenin was accused of having accepted funds from Parvis, of being in touch with him through a chain of intermediaries. Two species of evidence were quoted, the first being business correspondence between Parvis and Heinz, now one of the Bolshevik representatives in Stockholm. This dated from this period when both Parvis and Heinz resided in Copenhagen. Secondly, telegrams exchanged between Heinz in Stockholm and a well-known Petrograd barrister, Kozlovsky, and a Petrograd business executive, Madame Sumenson, had been intercepted by the Russian counterintelligence. In the telegrams, a code had been used. Kozlovsky was politically prominent as a leading Polish social democrat, a member of the executive committee of the Petrograd Soviet, and very close to the Bolsheviks. These telegrams were regarded as evidence for the treasonable money transactions between Parvis and the Bolsheviks, with Heinz being the link. A decree signed by the Attorney General of the Provisional Government ordered the arrest of Parvis, Heinz, Kozlovsky. Madame Sumenson, as well as of Lenin, Zinoviev, Alexander Kollontai, and others. Parvis and Heinz were abroad. Lenin and Zinoviev went into hiding. The others were arrested. Soon after, Trotsky and Lunacharsky were taken to prison too. There, Trotsky made a deposition outlining his former relations with Parvis. No evidence has ever been produced of Parvis transmitting money through Heinz to Kozlovsky. In October 1917, the Bolsheviks could point to the fact that Kozlovsky and Madame Sumenson had been released on bail by the Kerensky government. To them, this was proof that the charges had been shown to be groundless. When Parvis hit back in a pamphlet entitled My Answer to Kerensky and Company, published in August 1917 in Berlin, in a few words he contemptuously dismissed the charge of having given money to Lenin. The pamphlet was a bitter political attack on Kerensky, and it supported the Bolshevik line in every respect. Parvis called for a separate peace as soon as possible, and obviously expected the victory of the Bolsheviks in the near future. During this period, he approached nearer and nearer to the Bolshevik position. Parvis's fertile brain conceived what was undoubtedly the most extraordinary idea of his life. Parvis felt that the moment was approaching where Parvis could enter the arena of world history. When it came to peacemaking between Imperial Germany and Bolshevik Russia, there would be need for a man rooted in Russian and in German socialism alike, with powerful connections with the German authorities. In short, Parvis's great moment had arrived. Parvis must have felt that in the dream of alliance between the German social democracy and the Russian Bolsheviks, greater possibility for historic achievements would present themselves to him if he worked on the Russian side of this alliance. All Parvis's activities in the weeks after the October Revolution, which puzzled his German friends, can be explained by one idea. Parvis was energetically trying to work his passage home to the Bolsheviks. Immediately after November 7, 1917, Parvis arranged that he be sent as official party representative to those Stockholm Bolsheviks, Radek, Vorovsky, and Hanesky, who now comprised the only embassy of the new Russia abroad, to offer them the warmest congratulations of the German Social Democrats on the occasion of the Bolshevik victory. Parvis was convinced that he could exert enough influence to have peace negotiations carried out between the German Social Democrats and the Bolsheviks. The German working class would force a peace acceptable to the Bolsheviks on the imperial government by the threat of a general strike. In private conversation, Parvis explained to Radek that he was prepared to go to Petrograd and stand trial before a revolutionary tribunal. He was certain he would be convince the tribunal of his revolutionary sincerity and be allowed to place his abilities at the service of the Soviet government. The idea of peace negotiations by socialist parties on neutral soil became inextricably linked in his mind with the chances of his personal future in Russia, and the Stockholm Bolsheviks also were eager supporters of this suggestion. Parvis scored a great success in December 1917 when, on his initiative, Scheidemann arrived in Stockholm to have talks with Vorovsky. The German Foreign Office, however, was furious. They wanted negotiations by governments and not by socialist parties to be held not in Stockholm, but in Brest-Litovsk, and they expressed their attitude in forcible terms to Vorovsky as well as to Scheidemann. In his exalted mood, Parvis did not care whether or not he jeopardized his good relations with German official circles by his policy, as he was convinced that he was on the point of being sent to Petrograd by the German Social Democrats to negotiate with Lenin and Trotsky. It was at this point that Parvis brought out a Danish translation of his, quote, Answer to Kerensky, with a new preface. In this he acclaimed the Bolsheviks in ecstatic terms and expressed his conviction that the new regime in Russia was solidly founded. Quote, in 10 or 15 years, Russia will be the strongest and richest country in Europe, end quote. Parvis forecast the support of the Bolshevik regime by the labor movements of Western Europe. At the turn of the year, Parvis received the answer from Petrograd for which he had been anxiously waiting. Lenin refused his offer. This was a shattering blow, and the whole elaborate structure of fantasy Parvis had built up collapsed. Parvis's attitude towards the Bolsheviks changed overnight. Parvis's strictures on their policies spoke the language of unrequited love turned to hatred. Quote, the new state the Bolsheviks try to establish is not socialism, but a Chinese peasant state, which is bound to lead to a new Tsarism. The intellectual inspirer of Lenin is not Karl Marx, but Pobedonostsev. Pobedonostsev. End quote. Parvis wrote in March 1918. Linking the Bolsheviks with the famous apologists of Russian autocracy was the worst possible insult. When, in April 1918, Parvis published his Apologia pro vita sua, titled Im Kampf um die Wahrheit, Parvis emphasized to what extent he had turned into a German social democrat, and with what contempt he looked on the Asiatic features of Russian life, tendencies to which Bolshevism was giving a new strength. Parvis wrote as a disappointed man to whom the big chance of his life had been denied. In the Weimar Republic, Parvis wielded considerable influence on the Eminenz Gries to President Friedrich Ebert. But the role Parvis played after 1918 was of less importance than Parvis felt was due to his abilities. Parvis gradually withdrew from political and business activities. He died in December 1924. Two aspects of Parvis's personality contributed to rob Parvis of the great historical achievement of which all observers thought him capable. The unresolved tension between the German and the Russian elements within Parvis, and the importance Parvis gave to the acquisition of personal wealth, unusual in a revolutionary. Max Beer, whose background was similar to that of Parvis, said of him, quote, "He genuinely liked Germany, as so many Eastern European Jews do. The German language is to them the key to Western culture, a spiritual way out of the ghetto," end quote. Max Beer. In the vanished world before 1914, the exile from the Kuban had fallen in love with German civilization. When the war came, he felt the victory of the Germans over Russian semi-Asiatic backwardness to be a vital necessity. The tragic dividing line between advanced and underdeveloped countries ran straight through Parvis's soul. When the conflict came in 1914, Parvis realized that the political development of Germany and of Russia would follow different paths, a fundamental insight that the Bolsheviks refused to share. The Russian revolutionary, transformed into a German patriot, did all he could to bring about the Russian defeat from within for the sake of a German triumph. When the October Revolution came, however, the emotional attraction of the new Russia proved irresistible, and Parvis violently swung back to his old country, only to be rejected. It is related of Parvis that he described himself as an inverted Midas, in whose hands any gold he touched turned into dust and ashes. To get rich in order to be freed from the daily grind of the journalists, to have the time to concentrate on a great intellectual task had been his aim, but the work which would immortalize Parvis's name in the annals of political thought remained unwritten. Parvis, the political writer, is forgotten. The great journal with which Parvis's name would be linked as that of Herzl is with Kolokol failed. Die Glocke falls short of such a claim. The image which survives is that of an intriguer, a political agent, and a war profiteer. In a portrait of Parvis written by Alfred Rosenberg with a pen dipped in gall, it is said that in his last years Parvis spent much of his time in teaching young Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe the German language and the German way of life. This particular detail rings true, although most of the essay is worthless. It was a modest final variation of the basic theme of Parvis's life. It is significant that men as diverse in their political philosophy as Konrad Heinisch and Karl Radek found the same words for Parvis in their obituaries, a man of the Renaissance born out of his time. That's the end of the piece. Thanks for listening.